I still remember the way my father-in-law's hands trembled when the doctor opened that envelope. 30 years have passed, but I can still see the color draining from Richard Thornton's face as he read those DNA test results. He'd been so certain, so absolutely convinced that he'd caught me in a lie. He'd humiliated me in front of his entire family, called me a cheater, a gold digger, threatened to take my daughter away from me. But that piece of paper? It didn't just prove him wrong. It destroyed everything he'd built his entire identity on. Let me start from the beginning. I was 28 when I married David Thornton. I'd been teaching elementary school in Portland for 5 years, living in a modest apartment, driving a car that needed duct tape to keep the muffler from falling off. David was different from anyone I'd ever met. He worked at his father's investment firm, wore suits that cost more than my monthly rent, but when he walked into that coffee shop where I was grading papers, he had the kindest eyes I'd ever seen. We dated for a year. His father, Richard, made it very clear from the start what he thought of me. "She's after your money, son," he'd say right in front of me. "Girls like her always are." But David loved me, and despite his father's objections, we got married in a small ceremony that Richard refused to attend. The first year of marriage was beautiful. We bought a house in the suburbs, and I continued teaching while David worked his way up in the company. But there was one shadow hanging over everything. We wanted a baby. God, how we wanted a baby. Month after month, negative pregnancy tests. I tracked my cycle religiously, took my temperature, did everything the book said. Nothing worked. After 2 years of trying, we went to see a fertility specialist. Dr. Patricia Chen was her name. I'll never forget sitting in her office, David holding my hand, as she delivered the news. "Margaret," she said gently, "your egg quality is severely diminished. It's not impossible, but natural conception is unlikely. However, I want you to know there are options. IVF, in vitro fertilization." Back then, in 1994, it was still relatively new, still controversial. But Dr. Chen explained that even with IVF, my eggs might not be viable. There was another option, though. A donor egg. We could use David's sperm with a donor egg, and I could carry the baby. The baby would be genetically David's, would grow inside me, would be ours in every way that mattered. Except for one thing, it wouldn't be genetically mine. I cried for 3 days straight. David held me, told me it didn't matter, that he loved me, that we could adopt if I wanted. But I could see the longing in his eyes. He wanted a child. His child. And if I'm being honest, I wanted to give him that. I wanted to experience pregnancy, to feel a baby grow inside me, to give birth. We decided to do it. But we made one decision that would come back to haunt us. We decided not to tell anyone about the donor egg. David's father was already so judgmental about everything. He constantly talked about the Thornton legacy, about family bloodlines, about how important it was to carry on the family name properly. If he knew we'd used a donor egg, he'd never let us forget it. He'd probably claim the baby wasn't really his grandchild. So we kept it secret. We told everyone we were doing IVF because of my age, which was partially true. We went through the process quietly. I took the hormones, went through the procedures, and miraculously, it worked on the first try. I was pregnant. Those 9 months were the happiest of my life. David was attentive and loving. Even Richard seemed to warm up to me a little, though he constantly made comments about how the baby better have the Thornton nose, or how he hoped she'd get the family's green eyes. That should have been my first clue about what was coming. Our daughter, Emily, was born on a Tuesday morning in May 1995. 10 pounds, 2 ounces, healthy and beautiful. She had David's dimples, his strong chin, but her eyes were brown. Deep, warm brown, not the famous Thornton green eyes. The first time Richard saw her, he stared at her for a long time without saying anything. David was so excited, holding Emily, showing her to his father. "Look, Dad, isn't she perfect?" Richard's face was strange, calculating. "She doesn't look like a Thornton," he said finally. "Dad, she's 2 hours old," David laughed. "Babies change." But Richard wasn't laughing. Over the next 2 weeks, as I recovered at home, he visited every day. Each time, he'd stare at Emily with this look I couldn't quite read. He'd make comments. "Strange that she doesn't have any Thornton features. Her hair is so dark." Where does that come from? Are you sure the hospital didn't mix up the babies? David brushed it off, but I could see it was getting to him. And then, exactly 3 weeks after Emily was born, Richard called a family dinner at his estate. He said he had something important to discuss about the baby. I didn't want to go. I was exhausted, still recovering. Emily was fussy. But David insisted. It's probably about her trust fund or something, he said. You know how my father likes to make a production of everything. I should have trusted my instincts. We arrived at the Thornton estate on Saturday evening. Richard's house was massive, one of those old Portland mansions with marble floors and crystal chandeliers. David's sister Caroline was there with her husband, David's Uncle Thomas and Aunt Patricia, even some cousins I'd only met a few times. Maybe 20 people total, all gathered in the formal dining room. Richard stood at the head of the table, and the way he looked at me made my blood run cold. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "I've asked you here because we need to discuss a very serious family matter. It concerns David's, the baby." The way he said the baby instead of Emily, or my granddaughter, made my stomach drop. "Dad, what are you talking about?" David asked, confusion clear in his voice. Richard pulled out a folder. "I've had some concerns about Emily's paternity, concerns that I felt needed to be addressed before we made any decisions about trusts, about her place in this family, about the Thornton legacy." The room went silent. I felt like I couldn't breathe. "So I took the liberty," Richard continued, his eyes fixed on me, "of arranging for a DNA test." "You did what?" David stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Son, sit down. I did what any responsible person would do when presented with a situation that doesn't add up. Margaret's been unable to conceive for years. Suddenly she's pregnant. The baby looks nothing like our family. I think we all know what that suggests." I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. Everyone was staring at me. "You think Margaret cheated?" David's voice was shaking. "You actually think?" "I'm not accusing anyone of anything," Richard said smoothly. "I'm simply saying we need to verify. If the baby is yours, wonderful. We'll all apologize to Margaret and move forward. But if she's not..." He let the implication hang in the air. "This is insane," I finally managed to say. "Emily is David's daughter. How dare you?" "Then you won't mind taking the test," Richard interrupted. "I've already arranged everything. Dr. Harrison will be here tomorrow to collect samples from David and the baby. We'll have results in a week." "Dad, you can't just..." David started, but Richard cut him off. "I can, and I have. David, you're my son. You're going to inherit this company, this family's wealth and reputation. I won't stand by and watch you be made a fool of. If that baby is yours, fine. But if she's not, if Margaret has been lying to you, then we need to know. The Thornton name means something." Caroline was nodding. "Dad's right, David. You need to be sure." "I am sure," David said, but I could hear the doubt creeping into his voice. "Margaret wouldn't." "Wouldn't what?" Richard pressed. "Wouldn't do whatever it took to secure a wealthy husband? To trap you with a baby that might not even be yours? That's not what happened." I was crying now, holding Emily tighter. "I would never." "Then prove it," Richard said coldly. "Take the test." I looked around the room. Every single person was looking at me with suspicion. Even David wouldn't meet my eyes. In that moment, I realized I had no choice. If I refused, they'd assume I was guilty. The truth about the donor egg would come out anyway once they did the test. But maybe, just maybe, there was a chance they'd understand, that David would stand by me. "Fine," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We'll do the test." Richard smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "Excellent. Dr. Harrison will be here at 10 tomorrow morning." The rest of the dinner was torture. No one spoke to me. They talked around me, about me, as if I wasn't there. David sat silently, not defending me, not even looking at me. When we finally left, he drove home in complete silence. I sat in the passenger seat, holding Emily, crying quietly. "Did you?" he asked finally, as we pulled into our driveway. "Did I what?" "Cheat on me." I looked at him, this man I loved, and saw only doubt. "No, David, I didn't cheat on you." "Then why is my father so convinced? Why doesn't Emily look like us?" "Because genetics are complicated. Because babies Margaret, I need the truth. Is Emily mine? She's ours, I said. And it was the truth, even if it wasn't the whole truth. He didn't believe me. I could see it in his face. That night, I slept in the guest room. Emily woke up every 2 hours, and I fed her alone, crying into her soft hair, wondering how everything had fallen apart so fast. Dr. Harrison came the next morning. He was professional but cold, taking cheek swabs from David and Emily while Richard watched like a hawk. I wasn't tested. They didn't need my DNA to determine if David was the father. Results in 5 to 7 business days, Dr. Harrison said as he packed up his samples. Those were the longest days of my life. David barely spoke to me. He slept in the guest room, came home late from work, avoided being alone with Emily. Richard called every day, asking if we'd heard anything yet, reminding David that he needed to be prepared for any outcome. I called Dr. Chen, the fertility specialist, in a panic. The DNA test is going to show David as the father, right? Because we used his sperm? Of course, she assured me. Genetically, Emily is absolutely David's daughter. The donor egg doesn't change that. But they'll be able to tell about the egg, won't they? Depending on how detailed the test is, yes, potentially. But Margaret, honey, you need to tell David the truth before these results come back. She was right. I knew she was right, but I was terrified. What if he left me? What if his family convinced him that I'd somehow tricked him? On the 6th day, a Wednesday afternoon, Richard called. The results are in. We're all meeting at my house tonight at 7. Doctor Harrison will present the findings. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. Okay. Margaret! Richard's voice was almost gleeful. I hope you've been looking for a lawyer. David came home early from work. He looked exhausted, defeated. We need to go to my father's house. I know. Margaret, before we go, I need to know. Is there anything you need to tell me? Anything at all? This was my chance. I should have told him everything right then. But I was so scared, and I foolishly thought that maybe, just maybe, if the test results proved Emily was his, we could move past all this without the donor egg ever coming up. Emily is your daughter, I said. That's all that matters. It wasn't enough for him. I could see that. We drove to Richard's estate in silence. This time, the crowd was even bigger. Caroline and her husband, Uncle Thomas, Aunt Patricia, several cousins, and even Richard's lawyer, Mr. Pemberton. They'd all come to watch my humiliation. Dr. Harrison was there, looking uncomfortable in his white coat, holding a manila envelope. Richard stood next to him, practically vibrating with anticipation. Let's get on with it, Richard said the moment we walked in. Dr. Harrison, please share your findings with the family. Dr. Harrison cleared his throat. I've completed the paternity test comparing David Thornton's DNA with the infant Emily Thornton's DNA. The room was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. The results show that David Thornton is not the biological father of Emily Thornton. The room erupted. Caroline gasped. Uncle Thomas started yelling. Richard's face transformed into a mask of rage and vindication. I knew it! Richard shouted. I knew you were lying. You cheating, gold-digging. Wait, Dr. Harrison said loudly, cutting through the chaos. I'm not finished. Everyone fell silent again. There's something unusual in these results, Dr. Harrison continued, looking distinctly uncomfortable now. When I ran the paternity test, I also ran a standard genetic profile, as is protocol. And I found something unexpected. What are you talking about? Richard snapped. The test proves she's not David's child. What else matters? Mr. Thornton, Dr. Harrison said carefully. The genetic markers in David's DNA show some anomalies. Anomalies that prompted me to run a comparison against your DNA on file from your last physical. Richard's face went from red to pale. Why would you do that? Because the anomalies suggested a pattern I've only seen in cases of Dr. Harrison. Paused, looking at me, then at David, then back at Richard. Mr. Thornton, are you aware that David is not biologically your son? You could have heard a pin drop. That's ridiculous, Richard sputtered. Of course David is my son. This is... The genetic markers don't lie, sir. David shares no more DNA with you than he would with a random stranger. Based on the patterns I'm seeing and comparing with medical records from the time period of his birth, It's highly likely that David is the result of donor insemination." David stood frozen, staring at his father. "What is he talking about?" Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish. There must be some mistake. But I saw it then. The truth in his eyes. He'd known. Maybe not consciously. Maybe he'd buried it so deep he'd convinced himself it wasn't true. But somewhere inside, he'd known. "Your mother," Richard finally said, his voice barely audible. "Your mother had. We had some difficulty conceiving. She insisted on certain medical procedures. I didn't. I never." "You used donor sperm," David said flatly. "Just like we did. Just like we used a donor egg." The room erupted again, but this time, all eyes were on Richard instead of me. "You hypocrite!" Caroline shouted at her father. "You put Margaret through hell, accused her of cheating, humiliated her in front of everyone, and you did the exact same thing?" "It's not the same," Richard tried to say. "It's exactly the same," David roared. He turned to me. "A donor egg. That's why Emily doesn't have the Thornton eyes. That's why you've been so scared. We used a donor egg." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I wanted to tell you. I was going to tell you. But your father, he was so obsessed with bloodlines and legacy, and I thought if we kept it private, if no one knew, it wouldn't matter because Emily is yours, David. She's genetically yours. The egg doesn't change that she's your daughter." Dr. Harrison nodded. "That's correct. The test shows conclusively that David is Emily's biological father. The donor egg means Mrs. Thornton isn't Emily's genetic mother, but genetically, David is absolutely her father, which, ironically, is more than we can say about the relationship between David and Richard." Richard sank into a chair, his face ashen. "My whole life," he whispered. "Everything I built, the Thornton legacy, the bloodline, it was all a lie." "No," David said firmly. He picked up Emily from my arms, holding her close. "It wasn't a lie. Mom was your wife. I'm your son. Not because of DNA, but because she raised me. Because you raised me. That's what makes a family. And Emily is my daughter, our daughter. Not because of Margaret's eggs or your precious bloodline, but because we chose her. We wanted her. We love her." He turned to me. "I'm so sorry. I should have believed you. I should have trusted you. I should have stood up to him from the beginning." I was crying too hard to respond, but I reached for him, and he pulled me close, the three of us standing together while his family looked on in stunned silence. Richard never apologized to me. Not that day, not ever. He died 5 years ago, and even at his funeral, he couldn't quite look me in the eye. But David changed that day. He stood up to his father, set boundaries, and made it clear that Emily and I were his priority. He left his father's company and started his own investment firm. We had 2 more children, both through IVF with donor eggs, and this time, we told everyone who asked. We didn't hide. We didn't let anyone make us feel ashamed. Emily is 30 now. She's a doctor, specializing in fertility medicine, helping other couples navigate the same journey we did. She knows the whole story. We told her when she was old enough to understand. She says it's what inspired her career choice, wanting to help create families, no matter what form they take. Looking back now, from this distance of 30 years, I can see that Richard's cruelty was born from his own shame and fear. He'd built his entire identity on this idea of legacy and bloodline, and deep down, he knew it was built on sand. That's why he lashed out so viciously when he thought I'd done the same thing. He was projecting his own guilt onto me. But here's what I learned from all of it. Family isn't about DNA. It's not about bloodlines or legacies or whose eyes a baby has. It's about love. It's about showing up. It's about choosing, every single day, to be there for each other. Emily doesn't share my DNA, but she has my smile. Not because of genetics, but because she learned it from watching me. She has David's kindness, not because it's in her genes, but because he modeled it for her every day of her life. And when she introduces me to her friends, she doesn't say this is my egg donor recipient mother. She says, this is my mom. And that's all that matters. The DNA test that was supposed to destroy my family ended up teaching us the most important lesson of all. Richard spent his whole life obsessed with blood, and in the end, it meant nothing. David and I spent our lives focused on love, and it meant everything. So to anyone out there struggling with infertility, or using donors, or adopting, or building a family in any non-traditional way, don't let anyone make you feel like your family is less real because it doesn't fit their narrow definition. DNA is just a blueprint. Love is what builds the house. And to anyone who's being judged by someone like Richard was, someone who claims to care about legacy and tradition and bloodline, just remember, chances are, they're hiding something too. People who are secure in their own truth don't spend their time tearing down others. I look at my daughter now, at my grandchildren. Yes, Emily has 2 beautiful children of her own, also through IVF, and I don't see DNA sequences. I see family. I see love. I see the legacy that actually matters. That day, 30 years ago, when Richard stood in his mansion and tried to destroy me with that DNA test, he thought he was protecting his family's legacy. Instead, he revealed the truth, that the Thornton legacy was never about blood at all. It was about the bonds we choose to forge, the love we choose to give, and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Richard lost his son that day, not because David wasn't genetically his, but because his actions showed David what kind of man he really was. David chose differently. He chose love over legacy. He chose family over bloodline. And now, when people ask me about family values, about what really matters, I tell them this story. I tell them about the DNA test that was supposed to tear us apart but instead taught us what it means to truly be a family. Because in the end, family isn't who you're born to. It's who you choose to love, who chooses to love you back, and who stands beside you when the rest of the world walks away. That's the real Thornton legacy. Not Richard's obsession with genetics and bloodlines, but the love that we built together, one choice at a time, one day at a time, one moment at a time. And it's a legacy I'm proud to pass on.